All right, so buckle up. Today, we're taking a trip back to 1946. We're diving deep into Ellen G. White's Country Living. This book, even all these years later, is still getting people thinking about ditching the city. Trading it all in for a simpler life out in the country. I mean, hasn't everyone dreamed about escaping the city and finding that peaceful country life?
It really is interesting. I mean, this book, it was written right after World War II, but the ideas are still relevant today. And, even though it's written from that Seventh-day Adventist perspective, we can still look at the ideas themselves, see what they might offer anyone who's, feeling that pull towards a different kind of life.
Exactly. And let's make this clear. We're all about the ideas here, not pushing any specific beliefs. So Ellen G. White, she comes out strong, right? Her message,
Yeah.
Leave the cities. She really lays out a tough image of what city life is like.
Yeah, no kidding. White, she saw cities as dangerous places, spiritually and physically. She even describes them as like breeding grounds for bad behavior, materialism, places where people just lose sight of what's important. She even uses some pretty strong language, talks about a tide of corruption, and even compares cities to Sodom and Gomorrah.
Whoa, hold on. Comparing cities to Sodom and Gomorrah, that's pretty intense.
Yeah.
But I guess thinking about it, these fears about morality, they weren't exactly unusual after the war, right?
Yeah, there was definitely a feeling of disappointment. People were looking for stability after the war. So keeping that context in mind is important when we look at White's warnings about vice and, dissipation.
Yeah.
She was really worried about young people, especially getting caught up in all the temptations city life offered.
It's like she saw cities as these giant whirlpools of temptation, pulling people away from like a simple God-centered life. But it wasn't only moral corruption she was concerned about, was it?
Oh.
She also had some thoughts on labor unions, didn't she?
Oh, she did. And this is where her Seventh-day Adventist views really come into play. She saw labor unions as part of a bigger spiritual battle, aligning them with forces she believed would lead to oppression and chaos in the last days.
So for her, it wasn't about workers' rights or economic fairness or anything like that. It was tied to her interpretation of the Bible and the end of the world. It really makes you think how she'd see labor movements today, the fight for social justice and all.
It really does. Her view, encouraging people to stay away from unions, it's completely different from how many people see unions today. Today, they're seen as protectors of workers' rights. It just shows how exploring these historical perspectives, even if we don't agree with them, can get us to think critically about our own ideas.
It's like looking in a mirror, right? Seeing how our values today, the things we find important, stack up against those from the past. But let's change gears a bit. Let's talk about something I think a lot of people can connect with, no matter their background. Parenting. White had strong opinions about raising kids in a rural environment, didn't she?
Oh, she definitely did. She believed that growing up in the country was absolutely essential for kids. It was good for their spirit, their morals, their physical development. Imagine it. Kids growing up surrounded by nature, learning hands-on skills, becoming hard workers, and connecting with God's creation.
It's a beautiful picture, right? Like something out of a Norman Rockwell painting. And I admit, a part of me does romanticize that kind of life, especially with all the worries we have now about kids and screens, the pressures they face growing up today.
Oh, absolutely. White's vision, it taps into that timeless desire for a simpler, more wholesome way to raise children. She even goes as far as to say that city schools, they actually hurt kids' character development.
She even warns about cities being, what she call them, hotbeds of iniquity,
Yeah.
corrupting young minds. Whether you agree with that or not, she definitely saw the countryside as a kind of safe haven, protecting children from all those bad influences of city life.
And this idea of nature having a positive influence on child development, it's not unique to White, right? Think about all the research today. The benefits of outdoor play, being exposed to nature. It's good for kids' mental and physical well-being.
Absolutely. There's just something about being in nature, right? Something that feels nurturing. Maybe it's good for adults too, who knows? But I'm curious, if we take a step back and really look at White's arguments for raising kids in the country, what parts do you think still make sense today? And what might need a little reinterpretation for a modern audience?
That's a great question. One thing that still resonates today is her focus on practical skills, teaching kids to work hard. Those are valuable qualities no matter where you are, whether you're growing food or designing the next big app.
Sure enough. And finding that balance between technology and nature, that's another idea that seems relevant today. White might not have had iPads to worry about, but she was concerned about distractions, temptations that could pull people away from a simpler, more grounded way of life.
Exactly. Which brings us to another big theme in country living. How to actually support yourself in a rural setting. White doesn't just tell people to leave the cities, she offers some real ideas for making a living in the country.
Okay, let's get practical here. What kind of opportunities did she see for people making that move to rural life? Was she talking about everyone becoming farmers?
Well, she was definitely all about farming. It was a way to connect with God's creation and be self-sufficient. But she also suggested things like gardening, growing fruits and vegetables, even starting health food businesses.
Health food businesses back in 1946. Wow, she was ahead of her time.
Yeah.
It's like she predicted the whole farm-to-table movement way before it was cool.
Yeah, it is. It's fascinating how some of her ideas, things that might have seemed out there back then, align with what's popular today. But it's also important to remember that rural life, especially the economic side of it, probably looks different now.
Right, I imagine starting a small farm or a homesteading business today comes with its own challenges, a lot more complex than back then. But there's definitely a renewed interest in these alternative ways of living, especially among younger people.
There definitely is. And, White's practical advice might need some updating, but her core message, that message about self-reliance, finding meaning in a simpler life, that still resonates. It asks all of us, what opportunities, even beyond farming, might we find in a rural setting? What can we do with our own skills and interests?
That's a question worth thinking about, for sure. It speaks to that enduring appeal of the countryside, that possibility of building a life connected to nature, to your community, maybe even a little bit of that entrepreneurial spirit. But White doesn't stop at practical advice, does she? She also brings in some pretty serious warnings about the future, the need to be spiritually prepared. And that's where things get really interesting, maybe even a little apocalyptic. We'll dive into all of that in part 2.
We will. In the meantime, think about what stood out to you so far. What questions are popping up? Jot them down because we'll be back to unpack those apocalyptic warnings and more in our next deep dive into Ellen G. White's Country Living.
Welcome back to our deep dive into country living. So last time, we were exploring Ellen G. White's thoughts on cities and that call for a simpler life in the country.
Yeah, we talked about labor unions too, and raising kids in a good environment. We even got a sneak peek at her predictions about those future crises, the ones that make being self-sufficient so important.
Exactly. And now let's get into those apocalyptic warnings, because I got to say, there's something about predictions of the future, even if we don't take them literally, it's fascinating.
Oh, I agree. It's like trying to look into the future. So what kind of crises did White actually see coming? Was she talking natural disasters, economic collapse, or something even crazier?
Well, she definitely thought cities would be in trouble in the end times, like really vulnerable to all kinds of disasters. But one specific thing she talks about is the Sunday law crisis. The Sunday law crisis. Okay, what's that about? And why was it so important to White and her followers?
This really gets to the core of those Seventh-day Adventist beliefs. They observe the Sabbath on Saturday, based on their reading of the Bible. White believed that eventually, Sunday would be forced on everyone as the day of rest.
So it wasn't just about going to church on a specific day. It was more about religious freedom,
Right.
resisting what she saw as forced conformity, right?
Exactly. And for White, this wasn't just some abstract theological debate. It was a real threat that people needed to prepare for. She thought moving to the countryside was a way to separate from those worldly systems,
Right.
the ones she believed would become corrupt and oppressive.
It's interesting, this prediction coming from a specific religious perspective, it still speaks to a broader human fear, and the fear of losing freedom, individuality, the right to choose how we live and what we believe. It makes you wonder how those fears show up today, maybe in different ways.
For sure. Think about the debates we have now, about the government having too much power, data privacy, control of information. The specifics might be different, but those worries about losing our independence, they're still there.
Okay, so White predicted these crises, the Sunday law crisis and all, as part of the end times. But she didn't just leave people hanging with that worry, right?
Mhm.
She actually offered some ways to prepare for these tough times.
Absolutely. And that's where her practical side shines. White was a big believer in self-sufficiency. She urged her followers to learn skills, especially those related to food production, so they could take care of themselves.
So it was more than just stocking up on supplies and building a bunker. It was about having the knowledge and the resources to sustain yourself, you and your community, no matter what happened.
Exactly. She believed that those who'd moved to the country and learned to live off the land would be better off, better equipped to handle the coming storms, both literally and figuratively. It was about creating a kind of independence, a safety net made of practical skills and a strong community.
It sounds like a mix of homesteading, prepping, and strong spiritual faith. And while some people might think those ideas are a bit extreme, there's something attractive about being self-reliant, especially in a world that feels so unpredictable.
Definitely. And it's worth noting that these ideas about being self-sufficient, preparing for uncertainty, they've become popular outside of the Seventh-day Adventist community too. You see it in the growing interest in homesteading, permaculture, off-grid living, even just having a backyard garden.
True. It seems like more people are realizing how fragile our systems are, and they want to create more resilient ways of living, even if it's just on a small scale. But country living, it's not just about surviving the apocalypse, is it? It's also about creating a better, more fulfilling life right now.
Absolutely. And a key part of that is community. White believed that living close to like-minded people was essential for spiritual growth and support.
So it's not about being isolated in a cabin in the woods. It's more about building a network of people who share your values, people who can support each other no matter what. Kind of like a modern-day village, maybe with a bit more spiritual focus.
Exactly. And it's interesting how this focus on community connects to a basic human need, the need to connect, to belong, to have a shared purpose. Even in our super-connected digital world, people still crave those face-to-face interactions, a community where you feel seen and supported and understood.
It makes you think maybe this desire for community is part of what's driving things like co-living spaces, intentional communities, even online groups focused on things like homesteading or sourdough baking. Like we're trying to recreate those village connections in new ways.
I think so. And White's vision, even though it's rooted in religion, it offers some timeless wisdom about human connection and the power of shared values.
Now, let's talk about another part of White's vision. Her perspective on education. She definitely valued education, but she had some very specific ideas about what it should look like.
She did. And this is where her Seventh-day Adventist beliefs really shaped her approach. White was super important in starting the Seventh-day Adventist school system. It focuses on a holistic approach, combining spiritual, mental, and physical development.
So it's not just about academics. It's about the whole person, their character, their values, their connection to God. And she saw the countryside as the ideal place for this type of education.
Exactly. Imagine kids learning not just from books, but from nature itself. Working the land, taking care of animals, learning practical skills along with academic knowledge.
Like a mix of traditional schooling and hands-on learning, all happening in a faith-based community. And while that model might not work for everyone, there's something appealing about education being more than just memorizing facts and passing tests.
Definitely. And we see similar ideas in some alternative education movements today, like Waldorf schools, Montessori schools, even homeschooling co-ops. They recognize that learning should involve the whole child, not just their brain.
Right. And it makes you wonder if we can take those ideas, those elements of experiential learning and character development, and bring them into more mainstream schools.
That's a conversation worth having. But for White, education wasn't just about personal growth. It was also about preparing young people to serve God and humanity.
So instilling a sense of purpose, wanting to contribute to something bigger than themselves. And that was closely connected to her spiritual beliefs.
Absolutely. And that brings us back to the core of country living. Living a simpler, more grounded life. It's not just about being practical. It's about aligning yourself with God's will, being ready for the future, and ultimately finding true fulfillment.
It's a vision that might not speak to everyone, but it offers an alternative to the constant hustle of modern life. A call to slow down, connect with nature, and find meaning beyond material things.
Exactly. And in the last part of our deep dive, we're going to explore some of the more challenging aspects of country living. Things like White's views on race and social justice. And we'll think about what her ideas mean today, their legacy.
So stick with us. There's still a lot to unpack as we continue exploring Ellen G. White's country living. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the final part of our journey. Welcome back to our final look at Ellen G. White's country living. We've covered a lot of ground. Her take on city life, those practical tips for living in the country, and even her thoughts on what the future might hold.
Right. We've seen how her ideas combine self-sufficiency, being spiritually ready, and the importance of community. But now let's shift gears a bit. Let's look at some of the more, complicated parts of her work.
You're talking about those parts where her views from the 1800s might not exactly line up with how we see things today, right? specifically when it comes to race and social justice.
Exactly. We can't ignore the fact that White lived in a time when racial prejudice was just, well, a part of life. And sadly, some of that bias shows up in her writing.
It's tough studying historical figures, isn't it? You admire their ideas, and then you bump into something that's just wrong by today's standards.
It's a reminder that even the most influential thinkers are shaped by their time. We can't erase those problematic parts, but we can approach them critically. Try to understand the context, you know?
So, about race, what are we talking about specifically? What did White write that would raise red flags for readers today?
One of the most controversial topics is her stance on interracial marriage. White was against it. She was concerned about social harmony and the challenges mixed-race couples might face.
It's a stark reminder of how much progress we've made when it comes to racial equality. Something that might have seemed like a practical concern back then is clearly discriminatory and harmful now.
It is. And it's important to remember that those views, outdated as they might be now, weren't uncommon in White's time. But it also shows us that progress is a journey. Even people we see as pioneers of thought can hold beliefs that we now recognize as unjust.
It definitely reminds us to keep questioning, to keep evolving our own understanding of justice and equality. But moving beyond race, there's another area where White's views might spark some debate today: her perspective on the government.
Right. White was very wary of government power. She believed it should be as limited as possible. She was afraid that too much government involvement could threaten individual freedom and religious liberty.
The classic tension between individual freedom and the responsibility we have to each other. It's tricky, right? Where's the line? When should the government step in, and when should it stay out of people's lives?
Societies have been wrestling with that question forever. And White, coming from a background where she experienced religious persecution, she was really sensitive to anything that felt like a threat to individual freedom.
She even cautioned against getting too involved in politics, right? It was almost like she saw government as inherently corrupt, something to just avoid altogether.
She did. And that view might sound pretty radical today, especially in a world where we depend on the government for so much, like education, healthcare, infrastructure, social safety nets, and so on.
It does make you wonder how she'd see today's political landscape. All the different ideologies, the push for both more individual freedom and more government action.
That's a thought-provoking question. But even if we don't agree with her conclusions, I think there's something valuable in White's emphasis on personal responsibility, on being self-reliant.
Right. It's not about rejecting the government completely, but about understanding that we have a responsibility to take care of ourselves, our families, and our communities as well.
Exactly. And that spirit of self-reliance, of being proactive and resourceful, it fits with her country living vision. That idea of building a life that's less reliant on systems and more grounded in personal initiative and community support.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into country living, it's pretty clear that Ellen G. White was a complicated person, someone who had both profound insights and, well, perspectives that we see as flawed today.
Definitely a product of her time, but also a visionary, someone who challenged the way people thought and offered an alternative, a path toward a simpler life, one more connected to spirituality.
And while her ideas might not be for everyone, they can still get us thinking about how we want to live, raise our kids, and what kind of world we want to build.
Exactly. Country living might not be a step-by-step guide for modern life, but it has a lot of thought-provoking ideas, things that can make us question our assumptions and think about different ways of being in the world.
It reminds us that exploring these historical perspectives, even the tough ones, can help us reflect and grow. It's about taking what resonates with us, leaving the rest behind, and always working towards a more just, compassionate, and fulfilling world.
Well said. And for anyone who wants to learn more, check out the show notes. We've got links to resources about Ellen G. White, rural living, and all the topics we've discussed in this deep dive.
And a huge thanks to all our listeners for joining us on this journey. We hope you enjoyed diving deep with us. We'll be back soon with more fascinating explorations. Until then, keep those minds curious and those hearts open.